Welcome, everyone. I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm so glad you could join us today for our keynote session about cultural competency while serving the elder population. I'm delighted to have with us today Vivianne Mbaku. She is a senior staff attorney at Justice and Aging. Vivianne joined Justice and Aging in April of 2018 as a staff attorney in the Los Angeles office working on elder abuse issues. Before joining Justice and Aging, Vivianne was a staff attorney for the Utah State Courts Self-Help Center and practiced consumer and public benefits law with Utah Legal Services. Thank you so much for being here today, Vivianne. And we will take questions at the end, everyone.
Thank you, Christy, and thank you to everyone who's here. I hope everyone is having a good start of their week. So today I'll be presenting on cultural competence for the elder law attorney. And I will just preface to say that, my experience comes as a person who has worked as a legal services attorney previously, but I think a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are really relevant to anyone who's working with older adults. And, anyone, even if you're a non-attorney, can really benefit from some of the practices we'll talk about today. So as Christy said, I work for Justice and Aging. I'm a senior staff attorney and I'm out of our Los Angeles office. So Justice and Aging is a national organization that uses the power of law to fight senior poverty by securing access to affordable health care, economic security, and the courts for older adults with limited resources. We've been around since 1972 and we've focused our efforts primarily on fighting for people who have been marginalized and excluded from justice. People like women, people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and people with limited English proficiency. We also like to highlight with all of our presentations that at Justice and Aging, we believe to achieve justice, we must acknowledge systemic racism and discrimination, address the enduring negative effects of racism and differential treatment, promote access and equity in economic security, healthcare, and the courts for our nation's low-income older adults, and recruit, support, and retain a diverse staff and board, including race, ethnicity, gender, gender identity and presentation, sexual orientation, disability, age, and economic class. So we're going to start off just with what is cultural competence. So first off, let's just start off with what is culture. So culture is really kind of a nebulous idea. It's something that we know and experience every day, but we might not think about in concrete terms. I really like this quote that is from Raymond Carroll. A culture is like the air we breathe. It is largely invisible, and yet we are dependent on it for our very being. Culture is the logic by which we give order to the world. The dictionary also says that culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. I like to think that when we're talking to attorneys, we want to think about the cultures that us as attorneys move through every day. So you might not think about it as a culture, but like lawyering and people who are lawyers within the legal field have their own culture that we, participate in or maybe fight against every day. There's a legal aid culture. So just thinking about the types of cultures that you might experience every day as a person and the ways that you move throughout each of these cultures, and whether or not you really move through them, easily, or if it's kind of jarring with the different cultures that you interact with every day. So, what is cultural competence? So, cultural competence is the idea of embracing the principles of equal access and non discriminatory practices in service delivery. So, in terms of a legal services attorney, cultural competence means a lot of different things. It can mean the ability to adapt your practice to culturally diverse situations, the ability to honor the lived experiences of your clients, the ability to reject assumptions and stereotypes and recognize the ways that culture may impact the delivery of services, the ability to have empathy for your client, recognizing and honoring your client's autonomy, also recognizing and acknowledging your own privilege as an attorney. And also, I think one of the most important things is the humility to accept that you don't know everything, that the old way is not necessarily the right way, and that you can always improve. So when we talk about cultural competence, you might have heard of these other terms that are actually just related concepts and really kind of encompass the same idea. So there's also what people talk about is cultural humility. So this is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique. Where an individual not only learns about another culture, but also starts with an examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identities. And so cultural humility is really about the individual acknowledging and examining the cultures that they interact with, that their clients interact with, and looking at how these cultures impact the service delivery. So, how they really interact. And then there's also cultural responsiveness. And so this is the ability to learn from and respectfully relate to other cultures and backgrounds. And it comes from acknowledging and understanding one's own culture and values while respecting those of others. So there's a lot of different concepts and a lot of different names for what I really think is the same idea. It's really, these concepts are the idea of us constantly being curious about ourselves and others and our own culture and the culture of others, and how that impacts the relationships that we have with people, the interactions that we have with people, and not letting those impede the service delivery that we're trying to provide. So it's really important that we need to be open to new ways of thinking, practicing, and being, and constantly available to new ways to better serve our clients. So anyone who's here in this presentation right now is doing that by learning about a new thing like cultural competence, cultural humility, cultural responsiveness. You're being open to new ways of thinking and practicing and being, and new ways to be a better advocate for your clients. So, when I talk about culturally competent legal services, I also always like to talk about the intersection with trauma informed practices, because I do think that these two concepts, these two types of practice, are really inextricably linked. So, if you have not already heard about trauma informed practice, it basically, at its core, is acknowledging how the traumatic experiences of your clients may impact the lawyer client relationship and adjusting your practice to accommodate the client and foster healing. Wrapped into trauma informed practice is also the acknowledgement that that we are human and that we can be impacted by the trauma of others. And so recognizing the impact of secondary trauma on your own practice and how you can mitigate that impact so that you can keep empathy in your work. The reason that it's important to talk about trauma informed practices along with cultural competency is because there is an intersection in terms of cultures and their impact, and then the trauma that may be wrapped around that. So racial, intersectional, and generational traumas are very common among clients, and we know that trauma rates are higher as clients age. And so looking at a trauma informed practice is really looking at also ways to be culturally competent, because the trauma your client may have experienced may relate to their racial identity, their sexual orientation. And so these things are combined. So it's really, as an attorney, it's important for us to look at both sides so that we can better serve our clients. So, as I mentioned, racial trauma is one of the intersections. So, this is trauma related to the experiences of racial discrimination. So recent studies have traced higher rates of PTSD among racial minorities to the experiences of their experiences of discrimination, and then also intersectional oppression. So people who have experienced various types of oppression, not just racial, but also racial and gender, or racial and sexual orientation, xenophobic microaggressions. So all of these traumas often intersect with the cultural context of interactions, and may create situations where an attorney may not be able to connect with their client in the way that they need to, may be confused about the way that their client is just making decisions, because it's really informed by their own cultural context and informed by the trauma that they've experienced. So it's really important that attorneys understand and recognize trauma, and also the culturally competent services that they can provide, so they can be a better advocate. So I have an example here that's going to give a little bit, flesh out these ideas a little bit. So we have an example of a legal services client. So we have Janet, an older Black woman who's come to your office for assistance with an eviction case. She is curt and short with answers to your questions and seems to be holding back. She does tell you that ever since her apartment building was sold, the new landlord has been harassing her. She says he speaks to her in a disrespectful tone and glares at her, and she feels that he wants her out because she is the only Black tenant in the building. So, an example of just analyzing this little vignette within the context of trauma informed services and then also culturally competent services. There might be a lot of things that are coming up in your mind when you think about this client and how you might interact with them. So, first off, do you acknowledge your privilege as an attorney? Are you acknowledging Janet's lived experience as a Black woman? Because that's a trauma informed and culturally competent practice. She seems to have something else going on. Are we possibly offering her accommodations? Are you being dismissive of her allegations of racial discrimination, thinking maybe that couldn't possibly be true? There's no way that her landlord is doing that. Maybe she is just taking these interactions in a different way. So, really looking at the culturally competent practice is acknowledging and understanding that the way that people interact with each other and the world around them is really informed by the things that have happened to them in the past. So, an attorney who's practicing in a culturally competent way could approach Janet in a very different way than an attorney who's just coming at every client, just as they are, and not considering the greater context of their experience, their lived experience, and what's going on with them. So now we're going to get into why cultural competence is important. We've already discussed a little bit of it, but I want to go into some, kind of demographic information to see the types of people that are clients for legal services and the attorneys that they're interacting with these clients. So, generally, the demographic of attorneys in the United States is very homogeneous. Um, these stats are the most recent stats that we have from the Department of Labor. So, Black attorneys only make up 4.6% of all attorneys, Hispanic attorneys 3.8%, Asian attorneys 2.9, and Native American attorneys 0.2. So, overall, um, the amount of attorneys that are in the US are overwhelmingly white, with attorneys who are with Legal Services Corporation organizations. So this doesn't include all legal services organizations, but this is the best data that we have of people who are serving legal aid. There is increased diversity, but still really far behind when you actually compare to the types of clients that people are interacting with in legal services. So Black attorneys, it's significantly higher, but still very low, 14.2%, 20% Hispanic attorneys, 5% Asian attorneys, and 1.3% Native American. But clients of LSC clients, 52% of LSC clients are people of color, 71.7% are women, and 21% of LSC clients are 60 and older. And we can assume that there's some pretty high numbers on the intersections of all three of those groups. So knowing that the clients and the demographic of the clients is, more the majority of them are people of color, while the majority of attorneys and the majority of LSC attorneys are white, there can be some interesting cultural clashes that really can impact the lawyer-client relationship and the ability to be a zealous advocate. Um, in addition, older adults of color are at risk for elder abuse, but cultural differences create different types of risk. So, the importance of culturally competent practices is really shown when we can see that the ways that older adults of color are interacting with the legal system and experiencing elder abuse differs, and it shows us that we really do need to have a different approach for different groups. We need to acknowledge that people are different. Everyone has experienced their own culture, other cultures differently. Their lived experiences are different, and it will impact our ability to actually help people. So unfortunately, these differences are really under researched. Most elder abuse research approaches all older adults in the exact same way as if they're a monolith. And we know that older adults are not a monolith. They've all experienced varying different experiences throughout their lives. And without acknowledging that, we don't see the differences and possibly don't see abuse as it shows up in different groups. Now I'm going to go over some elder abuse research briefs that have been created by the National Center on Elder Abuse. I've linked them in the PowerPoint that should be available for you guys on the conference platform. But I just wanted to highlight some of the interesting nuances of different cultural groups and their experiences of elder abuse to highlight why it's important to be culturally competent in approaching older adults who are experiencing abuse, because there's so many differences. So first off, Black older adults are disproportionately affected by financial exploitation versus other types of abuse as compared to non-Black older adults. Black older adults are more likely to be victim to stranger initiated scams. And then also of really great importance, Black older adults are actually more likely to not report elder abuse because of fear of experiencing racial discrimination from social services providers. So just knowing that a Black older adult may be less likely to reach out for help, may really a culturally competent response might be changing your outreach in Black communities to reach out to, maybe to find different ways to reach out to Black older adults who may be experiencing elder abuse and may feel uncomfortable. So maybe creating different outreach. Uh, Ways to outreach, also maybe creating different relationships and getting more connected with community groups or churches who are already in the community so that you can build that trust. Hispanic and Latino older adults. Um, Studies have shown that Latino older adults may not perceive financial exploitation as abuse because interdependency is common. And a study of older women found that Latinas identify putting an elderly relative in a nursing home as being an abusive act. So a really good example for the first one is, legal services attorney may be examining someone's case and see the way that money is shared within a family as possibly abusive, but the older adult may not see that as abuse because they feel that their money is not their money, it's their family's money, and it's there to support the entire family. And this slight, misunderstanding, cultural difference of how someone perceives financial exploitation can really, shift how your legal advocacy goes through. So you might be thinking that there is some kind of case for financial exploitation, but in reality, if the older adult doesn't feel that they are being exploited, there really isn't a case. So there's these kinds of nuances are really important for people to look at and to consider when they are interacting with other older adults of different cultures. So Asian and Pacific Islander older adults. First off, abuse among this group is really hard to categorize because there are so many subgroups that are encompassed within Asian and Pacific Islander older adults. But one 2008 study did find that Asian victims of abuse may be more likely to reveal the abuse specifically to a medical provider over other people that they might be interacting with. And I really encourage you to look at these two brand new briefs that they just did on some research on Korean older adults and Chinese older adults. It's really helpful. And then also Native American older adults. So within their cultural context, there's a deep history of mistrust between Native Americans and the government because of historic trauma from colonization, forced attendance at boarding schools, and destruction of cultural practices that may impact the ways that you're able to interact with and advocate for a Native American older adult. So for example, someone might approach or have a client who's a Native American older adult and just not understand why they are just, maybe very insistent about not getting involved with any kind of social services or reporting possible abuse to APS. Or a social services agency. And without considering that, there's this greater cultural context that's going on with this person and the reasons that they are, more reluctant, it may look like they're just being unreasonable. But when you really open your mind and think about, or possibly just ask them about the reasoning behind their decision, you see that there really is context for it. And honoring that context and trying to figure out a solution to their problem with all of that context is the culturally competent way to approach these types of situations. And if you want more information about that, the National Indigenous Elder Justice Initiative has a lot of really great information on Native American older adults who are experiencing abuse. And finally, LGBT older adults. So we need to remember that LGBT older adults would also often overlap all the other groups that we're talking about. So this intersectional oppression is occurring. But here, fear of homophobia or transphobia prevents a lot of LGBT older adults from seeking services and supports. I mean, isolation is a serious risk for LGBT older adults. But we also know that this population is going to double in the next 10 years, more than double actually. It's about 3 million right now, and we're expecting it to get up to 7 million in the next 10 years. And the research really shows that similar to Black older adults, a lot of LGBT older adults will not seek services and supports for abuse because they fear having to reveal personal information that might out them. And this is even more acute in really small rural communities where there's not a lot of people and something getting revealed might be spread throughout the community, and they're just really uncomfortable with personal information being shared with people that they can't necessarily trust. So now we're going to talk a little bit about implicit bias and how this is, recognizing your own implicit bias is another portion of being a culturally competent attorney. So I'm sure all of you have probably heard about implicit bias. So first off, explicit bias. Explicit bias is things that we are readily cognizant, like beliefs that we hold, biases that we are totally aware of. But implicit biases are those that we're actually unaware of. So they're so deeply lodged in our minds that they actually impact our reasoning without our conscious knowledge. And this is really this most nefarious type of bias and racism, homophobia, transphobia that lives deep within people it really is experienced through the culture that we have. And for example, many people have an implicit bias against those with dark skin as a result of generations of institutionalized racism. So one of the first steps in practicing cultural competency is really acknowledging that we have implicit biases and everyone does. And I think it's really important for people to understand that first off, having any kind of implicit bias does not make you a bad person. It makes you a human being. We all have these. It's learning to acknowledge them and to work around them is what we're trying to do with a culturally competent practice. It's not trying to eliminate all of them because I really do think it's impossible to do so because we're not even aware of what's going on all the time. So no, as I said, no one's immune to implicit bias. But the way to start digging out these implicit biases one good way is to take one of the Harvard University's Project Implicit Associations tests. Um, they there are several organizations that have these. This one is free, and they have many different tests. They have tests that are about implicit bias regarding color of skin. I encourage everyone within this within this presentation to take the one on age bias. And the way that the test works, it works on a subconscious level of clocking how quickly you click on certain things, because the way that you click on it can show deep down what your actual implicit selection is, not the one that you think like, oh, I don't want to click on that. I'm not ageist. I'm going to click on this person. So it's a way to confront and figure out where your biases lay. And then once you can confront those, you can recognize the ways that they may impede the representation that you're providing. So in practice, I know I just went over a ton of things. So there's a lot of different things that being a culturally competent lawyer really encompasses. And it may seem that you're not really sure where you should start. But in practice, there's some habits that I think are really important. So there was a really great law review article called Five Habits for Cross-Cultural Lawyering. And I think that gives people a really good place to start, other than obviously doing the implicit bias tests. So one, identifying cultural similarities and differences between a client. And so all five of these can be done when you're interacting with every single client that you have. They can be done multiple times throughout the representation because things change. So identifying cultural similarities between you and the client. And I will say you might have a client where you think, oh, we don't really have any cultural similarities, but I would encourage you to think, actually, you do, because your client's probably not an attorney and you are. And attorneys have our own very specific culture, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And that culture has its own language. We speak differently than other people. We are able to, code switch between our lawyer talk and our regular talk, the way that we talk to just people who are non-lawyers. The way that we interact with people, the way that we argue is different. We argue through motions and emails, while other people argue in a very different way. We provide proof of things in a different way. So, really acknowledging that the way that you interact as an attorney really should change when you're speaking with your client, because there is going to be a difference, and you want to make sure that your client is understanding what's going on, even if your client speaks the same language as you, and even comes from the same cultural background as you. So second is identifying how these differences influence interactions with the client. So obviously with this attorney and client, there can be a lot of ways that the way that you communicate can differ with the client, and also create issues. But also there's the issue of language. Is your client a native English speaker, or is English their second language? So that can interfere with the way that you're interacting with your client. Is your client from this country? Or are they not? Are they from the state that you're in or not? There's so many differences that you have to think about. You should really think about, and think about how they can influence the way that you're interacting with the client, and also influence what you're thinking about how you're thinking about the client, how you're thinking about their solution. Three, explore different interpretations of client behavior. So this is really a trauma-informed practice as well. As attorneys, I think we do have a tendency to judge our clients, and the ways that they interact, and the decisions that they sometimes make. And a lot of times we really do need to pull back and, one, remember that our client has lived their life, their whole life. So they're an expert in themselves. We're not. We're coming into their lives at one specific point in time, and making a judgment based on a small amount of information. So really looking to put empathy in the ways that we interact with them and we interpret their behavior, and then also looking at the greater context, the greater cultural context of the world that our client has lived in, what they've experienced over time, in what they've experienced throughout their lives, how they've been able to survive throughout their lives. And really, that gives you context. And I think a lot of times when you actually do that, you remove the judgment. When you're looking at your clients and you realize, oh, okay, someone's like actually making a decision based on what they think is best for them. And I really need to honor that. Four is identifying tasks that may bring up difficult cross-cultural communications and possible communications problems. So previewing things that may become difficult. So the most obvious is if my client is not a native English speaker, obviously I should get an interpreter so that I can make sure that I understand them. If my client speaks with sign language, making sure that I have an interpreter that is able to correctly interpret so that I understand what's going on. Making sure that I'm explaining complex legal issues to my client and making sure that they understand what I actually mean instead of just rushing through. Explaining something and not really checking that they get the context of what I'm trying to say. And then the last one is identifying places where the lawyer client relationship could derail and brainstorming corrective actions. So, this is really about preserving the relationship that you have with clients and working on ways to make sure that the relationship stays strong. So, obviously, there might be a time when, things go off because of a cultural miscommunication. People don't understand, you don't understand your client, they don't understand you, they don't understand the context, and making sure that your client, one, always understands that you're there to help them, you're there to represent them, you're on their side, and then figuring out ways to have corrective action. I think one really important thing is making sure that there's absolute transparency about what your role is, what the role of the courts is, and then also what the role of the client is. When those are clear, you tend not to have these types of, issues where people are really confused and don't know what's going on, and then the relationship starts derailing. Some other strategies, like I mentioned before, making sure that you're understanding the communities in your area and you have connections with other cultural groups within your area, giving you context on the older adult clients that you might be serving. For example, if you have an LGBT client, do they know that your organization is a safe space for them to come? How do they know that you're not going to, share information about their lives with other people? So as an attorney, a way to do that is making sure that they understand that, there's lawyer client privilege and that you will not share any information with anyone else because that's your ethical duty. But then also making sure that other community groups that serve LGBT clients in your community understand that at your organization, you have attorneys and attorneys have an ethical duty and we don't share information, so that everyone knows, so that that entire group can feel safe coming to your organization. So really engaging in different culturally specific groups in your community so that people understand that, maybe not everyone who works at your organization may look like those clients, but you guys know how to serve them and you're open to adjusting and recognizing the cultural group and serving them as well as you can. Um, Really encourage the creation of affinity groups on these issues at your organization. So getting people together who are interested in talking about culturally competent, trauma-informed practices at your organization, and looking at the ways that you work and ways that you can possibly change your work to make it more culturally competent. Joining a multidisciplinary team in your area and bringing cultural competence to the table. I really think MDTs are a really great approach, very good person-centered approach to elder abuse issues, and also a really good place to bring in culturally competent services, and really a place where you can think through a culturally competent approach to these more difficult elder abuse cases. Also, looking into your local data on elder abuse, who's reporting, who is not reporting elder abuse, who's affected. If you have if you haven't, you can go to the NAMERS website, which is the National Adult Maltreatment um, uh, online service, NAMRS. And this is where they have the data for a bunch of APS agencies throughout the country. And there's some good specific data about the people that are being served by your local APS. And that may be a good place to start into looking at, there's not really a lot of reports from this group, but I know that there's a lot of people from this group in my area. I wonder if there needs to be some kind of outreach to make sure that people understand what elder abuse is and that we can provide resources and we can represent people. And then also just taking the implicit bias test, as I mentioned, really making this is a ongoing process. This is cultural competence is not something that you do a presentation or two and you're just going to be perfect at. I'm not an expert either. It's an ongoing process that people are going to have to engage in throughout their entire careers and throughout their lives, constantly adjusting and learning new things. So I think it's just really important to understand this is a constant moving target, but it's worth it because it makes our advocacy so much better and it builds so much more trust between us and our clients. And we really are focused on wanting to actually help people. And this is a way that you can feel that you're really reaching your clients and actually able to help them in a way that they feel that they've been helped, not that they've been railroaded into a decision that they're not comfortable with. And that is the end of my presentation. And I want to see if there are any questions.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Vivianne. Everyone's being shy at the moment, but I do see a question that just came in, so don't be shy. This is your chance to ask questions. Will the slides be available, and are there any other materials? Yes, the slides are available right now on the FeedLoop platform. Under this session, you'll see the PowerPoint, which Vivianne has agreed to share with everyone, along with the CLE credits. And there's also a link to fill out a survey at the end.
There are also additional materials on the NICLR website. So Justice and Aging houses the National Center on Law and Elder Rights. And I wrote an issue brief on cultural competence there, and I will type in the website in the chat for you guys. But I will also put my email because if you have any questions, I'm willing to talk to you at any time about cultural competence, trauma-informed lawyering, anything like that, if you want more information.
Wonderful. Thank you for offering that. Got a compliment in the question box. This was very interesting. I agree. It's definitely different than other cultural competence presentations I've heard, and I definitely learned a lot, so I appreciate that. If I could be greedy and ask a question, since everyone's being shy, you spoke at the beginning about trauma increasing among the older adult population, and I may have missed why that might be.
Yeah, so trauma, first off, trauma, and I want to go over like a definition of trauma just so that I don't lose any people. So trauma is just as a general idea is any experience that someone has that is so overwhelming that they can't handle what happens. So trauma is very subjective. What is traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. So we hear lots of generalities about trauma, like people who have been at war, like veterans have experienced trauma, or people who have been through natural disasters, victims of sexual assault, victims of elder abuse. But there's lots of other types of trauma. It doesn't have to be a huge, quote unquote, huge situation for something to be traumatic. An eviction is traumatic. A contentious divorce case or child custody case can be traumatic to people. And it really, the trauma is indicated by it impacts their functioning and impacts their ability to function as a human being going forward. And there are lots of treatments for it, etc. But we do know from the research that trauma compounds as we age. So traumas experienced as a child do compound with traumas experienced as an adult, with trauma that's experienced as an older adult. So the research shows that as you experience the traumas and very commonly have not received necessarily mental health care, counseling, other resources that have helped you work through that, it compounds and also leads to possibly early death. They have found a connection between people who have experienced several adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that is directly linked with early death. And they think that is because the impact of the trauma on the person's life. And it can also make them more vulnerable to additional traumas later on in life. So we need to, all of that is to say that it's really important to acknowledge that if you have a client that is experiencing some kind of elder abuse, which is a form of trauma, it is likely that they've experienced other traumas in their lives. And that kind of trauma really does affect the way that people interact with each other. They may be unable to handle, certain stressful situations because of what's happened to them in the past. And it makes it that much harder to build that lawyer client relationship and to work with them. So it's really, trauma informed lawyering is really looking and understanding that people have experienced trauma and not letting that impact your representation. And within the cultural competence concept, just consider an older adult who has possibly experienced some childhood adverse experiences, which are not, even when you look at the list of like what they consider an adverse childhood experience, death of a parent, divorce of parents. I mean, it's not things that you're necessarily thinking like something absolutely horrific has happened to someone. These things pile up. So imagine someone's experienced that, and then they've lived through, let's say they're a Black older adult who's lived through the civil rights era, so they have that compound of racial trauma. And then let's say they're also LGBT Q. So they've also experienced homophobia within their lifetime and possibly still experiencing it. That's a lot of things that are really creating an interesting context of the way that they interact with the world, and really informs the way they're going to be able to interact with you as an attorney.
So intriguing and troubling that it can lead to early death and that traumas are cumulative. It totally makes sense. I just hadn't thought of it that way before. All right, we have some brave people with some questions. How should you approach a superior if you feel like they're not being culturally competent towards a client, not in a malicious way? So I assume they mean just kind of in an accidental way.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you I applaud you for having the courage to approach someone. I think it's the same way that you would approach them if you thought they were, maybe wrong on a legal issue. Um, I think it's approaching them with humility and, coming to them saying, I think we might want to approach this a different way. Give them the context of why you think you should approach it in a different way. It's really, I know that it's difficult if it's a superior, but I would think hopefully because they're a superior, they'd be open to, suggestions from people, and be humble enough to know that they're not always right, and really couch it in the fact that you're trying to provide the best advocacy for your clients. And so anyone who's trying to do that should be open to understanding there might be just a different way that might be better to deal with this client in particular.
Advice. We got another compliment. Great information, very needed. And then we have a question from a law student. Olivia is a rising 2L and was wondering if you have any suggestions for classes she should look to take in her 2L and 3L years.
Um, I would really recommend not necessarily a class, but volunteering at your local legal aid over the summer, because I think that that's going to be the best place to be able to, flex any of your culturally competent practices. Um, I don't think there's really many classes in law schools. This is not something that is really taught in law school because this is relatively new. I like to tell people, doctors and nurses, social workers, they are like 40 years ahead of us in terms of cultural competence, trauma informed practices, because as lawyers, we haven't really seen ourselves in that position. But we really are. We're interacting working with the same people. So I would say you can do your own research. And I've also read some really great law review articles that were written by 2Ls and 3Ls who were implementing practices during their internships at legal aid. So I think that's a really another great opportunity. Try to write in a law review article about this and why you think it's important, and focus on what are the cultural groups in your area that you think may have some specific ways that are really important to approaching them, and maybe highlighting something about certain groups in your area, that you think are important.
Great advice. And Olivia, I'm glad you're interested already, and maybe you can start something at your law school if they don't have anything about how to best serve older clients. I would also recommend if your law school has a veterans clinic, that could be helpful. Usually they serve the entire veterans population, but you'll probably get a good mixture of older veterans. All right, I see one more question. Do you have any practical tips on dealing with clients whose trauma presents as anger and sharpness? I find most clients just need more than one phone conference to build a relationship.
Yeah, I think that some clients are going to be um, they're going to be more difficult. Um, I think really consider that the client may never be your friend. They may never really, really like you. But your goal is to get information from them and get them to trust you. So I think just focusing on, you want the client to know that you're a person that can be trusted and that you're their advocate. And if you can get that, that's the goal. I don't think it's worth focusing on trying to get them to, be more pleasant during interviews, or when you're calling them. That may never happen. But making sure that they understand that they can trust you, that you are a person who's advocating for them, that you are not going to actively try to re-traumatize them, that you understand them and respect their lived experiences and you acknowledge them. That's going to be the most important.
Bison, I agree. It usually takes more than one phone call or more than one meeting. And something I always kept in mind when working with veterans is they're not angry at me in general. They're angry at the system that they're up against. So I think that's true of a lot of clients. They just want someone to listen to them respectfully and know that that person's going to try their best to help them.
Definitely. And I think acknowledging it's really, I talked about in the presentation, but really acknowledging your privilege as an attorney is important. Um, we need to remember that when we interact with clients, they see all attorneys as the same. They don't really differentiate the legal aid attorney from a prosecutor, from a corporate attorney. We all look the same to them. So really making sure that they understand who you are, what your role is, what you've committed to, what kind of work you've committed to, so that they can understand the context of, I'm not just an attorney, I'm your advocate. I work here. I really, I'm committed to serving people like you. Like, this is what I want to do, and this is what I care about, so that they can understand that you're a little bit different, and there, you have a different commitment to this type of work.
That is so important. And I think a lot of us forget that we are so privileged to be attorneys because we're surrounded by attorneys all day, every day. So that's important to acknowledge, as well as that clients probably think we work for the government or that we work for the system that they're arguing with. So that's a great reminder. I think we're done with questions. We just had one more compliment. So interesting. Thank you. It is a great reminder not to take anything personally. Good life advice. Well, thank you so much, Vivianne. I just want to remind everyone to fill out the survey at the end and let us know how much you loved Vivianne's information. So hopefully she'll come back next year for our conference. And you've got two choices at the next hour. So you have serving veterans, military and veterans cultural competency. So that would build well on this session. Or you can go in a different direction with the American Rescue Plan and safety net policies. So if you just go back to the lobby, you can choose which session you want to attend next. Thank you so much, Vivianne, for being here today. I really appreciate all the information.
No problem. This was great, and I hope to see you maybe next year.
Too. Take care, everybody.